Thexia, Episode 2, The Service Corridors. Temple Mount, age 12. The service corridors beneath the Senate Annex were a world few ever saw. Narrow veins of cold gunmetal gray, etched with faint blue conduit lines that pulsed like distant stars. The air tasted of ozone and warm circuitry, always a few degrees too cold. Thexia Etherion, 12 years old, moved through the darkness like she belonged to it. Her plain gray trainee tunic blended with the shadows. Her soft-soled boots made almost no sound. Inside the right pocket of her tunic, her fingers brushed once against the smooth edge of the small moonstone her mother had given her years earlier on Lysara 4. The stone was no bigger than her thumb, worn soft from how often she carried it. Kalis had told her trainees should not keep sentimental objects during surveillance rotations. She carried it anyway. For 3 weeks, she had followed Chancellor Tino on Instructor Kalis's orders. Watch, stay hidden, act only if alignment itself began to break. She lay flat in an overhead maintenance grate, the metal edges pressing hard into her palms and knees. Below her, a cauldron aide in formal Senate robes waited in the shadows. His posture was wrong, too relaxed, too ready. The slight bulge in his left sleeve told her everything. An injector. Tino would walk this junction in 4 minutes. The final seconds stretched thin. Thexia could already feel the wrongness. A faint, sour vibration started behind her eyes and crawled slowly down the back of her neck, making her teeth ache. The steady rhythm she had felt around Tino for weeks, calm, smooth, balanced, twisted abruptly beneath the aide's presence, as if something rotten had slipped into an otherwise perfect current. Kalis had once described alignment as feeling like standing beneath warm sunlight with your eyes closed. This felt diseased. The sensation cut through the clean ozone air like rot in fresh water. If that injector touched Tino, the corruption spreading through the aide would infect the entire current around him, turning the calm certainty Thexia had sensed for weeks into something jagged, unstable, and wrong. Her heart hammered. Her muscles were coiled tight. The fear was sharp, but she held it down. The aide reached. Thexia dropped. Metal rang beneath her boots. The aide twisted sharply, too fast. Thexia drove 2 fingers toward the nerve cluster at the base of his neck. Missed. Thexia was simply too small to reach the angle cleanly from where she had landed. Her strike hit higher than it should have, glancing off muscle and bone instead of the exact nerve point Kalis had drilled into her during training. His shoulder snapped up at the last instant, and her strike glanced away. Pain exploded through her arm as his elbow slammed into her collarbone. The aide staggered backward with a sharp curse, more startled than hurt, and finally saw her clearly. For one horrible second, his expression shifted from confusion to understanding. A child. Then his hand shot for the injector hidden in his sleeve. Thexia lunged before he could pull it free. She hit him low, throwing all her weight into his midsection, the way Kalis had taught smaller trainees to break a larger opponent's balance. It barely moved him. The aide grunted and slammed hard into the corridor wall, but instead of falling, he caught the front of her tunic in one massive hand. Thexia's feet left the ground. Panic surged white-hot through her chest as he shoved her backward. Her shoulder cracked painfully against the metal wall, hard enough to rattle her teeth. The injector slipped halfway free from his sleeve, dangling between them. The aide's grip tightened. Thexia could smell the bitter spice on his breath now, could hear the strain in his breathing. He was stronger than she had expected, far stronger, and for one terrifying instant, she realized that if he got both hands on her, the fight would already be over. She drove her knee upward instinctively. The blow struck awkwardly against his hip. Not enough. The aide snarled and tried to pin her harder against the wall. Thexia struck again. Harder. This time her fingers found the exact point Kalis had drilled into her 100 times in training. But the aide still did not go down immediately. His entire body jerked violently. One hand lashed out blindly past her face, fingers grazing her cheek hard enough to sting. Thexia twisted sideways before he could grab her again, boots skidding across the floor. For one terrifying second, the much larger man stayed upright, swaying, confused and angry, while she struggled to breathe through the pain blooming across her chest. Then he lunged. Thexia twisted aside at the last possible instant. Even off balance, the aide towered over her, his reach long enough that she could feel the air move as his hand swept past her face. She ducked lower on instinct, almost dropping to one knee just to get beneath his center of gravity. His shoulder slammed into the wall instead of her. Thexia saw the opening. She pushed upward on aching legs and drove her fingers into the nerve cluster one final time with everything she had left. The man's body locked rigid. Then he collapsed. The full weight of a grown man slammed into her. It hit like a sack of wet stone. Her knees buckled. Boots screeched across the floor. For one terrible second, she thought both of them were going down. She caught herself at the last instant, breath ripping painfully from her lungs, then hooked one arm beneath his shoulder and began dragging him toward the nearest utility closet, boots slipping across the metal floor as the full dead weight of the assassin fought her every inch of the way. The distance felt endless. For what felt like hours, Thexia inched backward, dragging the limp weight of the cauldron aide by the crook of one pale, outstretched arm. Every meter of progress stole strength from her. His boots scraped the corridor in a slow, sickening rhythm, sh, sh, shk, that set her teeth vibrating and seemed to echo for miles through the tunnel. Sometimes his legs snagged in the grooves between the floor panels, jarring her balance and nearly toppling them both. If she slipped, if she let go, the entire Senate annex would ring with the crash. She could barely see through the film of sweat and the stinging salt that burned her eyes, but she gripped harder and kept moving. Her shoulder throbbed from the blow, a deep pulse that grew sharper with each effort. She forced her feet to shuffle, then lurch, then steady. The corridor's temperature seemed to drop with every step, the cold biting into her arms, even as the rest of her body burned with exertion. Each tiny shift in the aide's dead weight brought fresh agony to the bruised ridge of her collarbone, and her breaths came in short, jagged gasps. She was aware, with every motion, of the surveillance nodes that dotted the ceiling at regular intervals, tiny black lenses, dead to the untrained eye, but alive with hunger. Thexia ducked her head as she passed beneath them, dragging her cargo close to the wall, trying to keep her own silhouette small and the cauldrons even smaller. Even now, pinned by pain and panic, her mind raced through the Order's counter-surveillance protocols. Shadow angles, electronic masking, the brief moments between sensor sweeps where a body could pass unseen. The corridor ahead stretched out like an accusation, silent except for the high, brittle whine of distant machinery. Around her, the blue conduit lines pulsed with new intensity, veins of energy that appeared to quicken, as if even the wiring sensed the wrongness she dragged behind her. Each blue pulse seemed to strobe into her field of vision, a metronome counting down the seconds until Tino's arrival, until she failed, until everything she had done would be for nothing. And still, she kept pulling. A right turn, then a left. The tunnel walls closed in, the space barely wide enough for her shoulders and the slack limbs that flopped with every bump and twist. Once, she lost her grip, and the man's head struck the metal floor with a muffled thunk. Thexia froze, pulse roaring in her ears, and waited for footsteps or the click of a gun, but the only reply was a deeper silence. She knelt, breathing in shallow bursts, and steeled herself to take up the load again. When she finally reached the utility closet, a slab of matte black set flush into the wall, disguised as a maintenance panel, her hands could barely function. She pressed her palm to the access pad, praying the lock would accept her clearance. For a second, nothing happened. The blue conduit lights flickered. Her vision tunneled, and she nearly screamed. Then the door hissed open, and cold air spilled out, somehow even colder than the corridor itself. She half dragged, half pushed the cauldron inside. The closet was narrow, just wide enough for 2 people, lined with shelves of cleaning solvents and spare sensor sweeps. She jammed him upright against the far wall, his chin flopping to his chest, and fumbled for the restraint cord on her belt. The first loop slipped from her numb fingers. The second loop tangled and bit into her own skin. She had to lean her entire weight into the process, arms shaking as she managed to cinch the man's wrists behind his back and then bind his ankles together, double wrapping the cord until her hands trembled too badly to keep going. She let go at last and stepped back, staring at the man she'd just neutralized. His face, so composed a few minutes ago, now looked slack, almost peaceful, except for the smudge of blood at his temple and the faint twitch in his eyelid. The injector he'd meant for Tino had rolled away in the scuffle, coming to rest against the closet's inner wall. Thexia eyed it with disgust and relief, then forced herself to pick it up and pocket it for evidence. For a few seconds, she hovered in the threshold, listening for the sound of pursuit, for alarms, for anything that would mean the corridor had witnessed her panic. But the world had gone totally still. She closed the door, sealed it, sank to the metal floor with her knees to her chest, and shivered. Then the adrenaline crash slammed into her. Her hands wouldn't stop shaking. Panic rose in thick waves, choking her. She slid down the wall until she was sitting on the cold floor, knees pulled to her chest. The metal was freezing against her back. The sharp chemical smell of the injector still clung to the air. Her arms and shoulders burned with a deep, throbbing fire that made her want to cry. She was only 12. How was she supposed to keep doing this? She stayed there for several long minutes, rocking slightly, pressing her forehead against her knees, trying to make the shaking stop. The cold floor bit into her legs. The closet felt too small, too dark, too full of the heavy, limp body she had just dragged. Every breath hurt. Slowly, the freezing gunmetal pressed against her back stopped feeling like part of the Senate annex. The hard industrial cold softened at the edges until it became something older and gentler, smooth stone cooled by evening rain beneath the open skies of Lysara 4 instead of steel buried beneath Temple Mount. The sharp chemical smell of solvents and ozone faded beneath something cleaner. Wet earth, damp grass, the mineral scent of rainwater running across the garden paths near her mother's quarters. Her breathing began to slow without her realizing it. The darkness around her softened at the edges. For one fragile moment, she could almost feel the difference between the two worlds at once. The harsh gunmetal floor beneath the frightened trainee she had become, and the rain-soaked stone beneath the barefoot child she had once been. She could hear Alethea laughing somewhere near the pond, bright and warm against the sound of rainfall. The memory did not arrive all at once. It drifted through her panic in pieces, the cool grass brushing her ankles, her mother's gentle hands pressing the moonrock into her palm, the warmth of her voice. "One day it will not be just your sister," Alethea had said softly. "One day it will be someone the whole galaxy needs kept safe." Thexia pressed her shaking hands tighter against her knees. "I will reach even when I am afraid." The promise returned with the memory, wrapping around the panic until the crushing pressure in her chest finally began to loosen. She had reached. She had kept the promise. Above her, Tino's footsteps passed the junction. calm, confident. He walked on, completely unaware. The danger had passed. She picked up the injector. It felt cold and dead in her palm. She disabled it, tucked it away, then slipped out of the closet and melted back into the service shafts. Every movement hurt. By the time she crawled through the hidden access hatch to the trainee levels, her tunic was soaked with sweat, and her legs were shaking so badly she could barely stand. Only then did she allow herself one slow, shaky breath. She had done it. Thexia moved slowly through the hidden service shafts afterward, one trembling hand sliding along the cold walls to steady herself whenever her legs threatened to give out. The narrow maintenance tunnels hummed softly with power beneath Temple Mount, blue conduit lines casting faint light across her exhausted face. More than once she had to stop and press her forehead against the metal just to steady her breathing before forcing herself onward again. By the time she finally reached the trainee barracks levels, every part of her hurt. Later that night, back in the trainee barracks, Instructor Kalis found her sitting on the edge of her bunk. The room was sparse and dimly lit. Kalis leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed beneath the dark folds of his instructor mantle, studying her with the detached stillness of a man trained to hide every unnecessary emotion. Chancellor Tino reviewed the sealed echoes, he said at last. Thexia felt her stomach tighten at the phrase. Sealed echoes were not ordinary reports inside the Order. They were resonance recordings locked away from everyone except senior instructors and the highest levels of command, moments considered important enough to preserve inside the Codex archives. The current bent around you cleanly enough that even his senses passed over the disturbance, Kalis continued, yet the shadow remained in the resonance. He paused briefly before speaking the next words, and even his controlled voice carried the faint weight of ritual. He has invoked the old rite of quiet bearing. He wants you attached to his personal detail. Thexia had only heard the phrase twice before during training lectures. Quiet bearing was one of the oldest vows in the Order, a life binding placed upon those trusted to stand unseen beside the most important figures in the Alliance. Children whispered about it like a ghost story. Thexia looked up slowly. Her arms still ached, her shoulders burned. The weight of what he was saying pressed down on her chest until it was hard to breathe. She was 12, and the most important voice in the Senate had just asked for her. Kalis's gaze never left her. You held alignment while fear clawed at your thoughts, he said. Most adults fracture the current the first time they feel corruption pressing against them. You did not. The Order remembers that. He stepped fully into the room then, the low blue light catching the silver threading along his mantle. But hear me clearly, cadet. To walk in a chancellor's shadow is not an assignment. It is a binding. The Order will carve your name into that duty until the flame itself releases you from it. No rotation, no distance, no life untouched by the burden. Are you prepared to carry that weight? Thexia looked at the floor. The ache in her shoulders had settled into something deeper, something that felt less like muscle and more like the space between her ribs. She was 12. For a moment, she thought of nothing in particular. Not the Order, not the corridors, not even Tino. Only warm sunlight on wet stone. Then her mother's voice returned softly through the memory. One day, it will not be just your sister. One day, it will be someone the whole galaxy needs kept safe. Thexia swallowed hard. Slowly, deliberately, she gave a single nod. Kalis regarded her in silence for several long seconds, as though weighing something unseen around her. Then he gave the faintest nod. Rest while the current is still calm, he said quietly. Once the flame places its hand upon your path, it rarely loosens its grip. She lay down carefully on the narrow cot, lowering herself inch by inch because the bruised muscles across her shoulders and back screamed every time she moved too quickly. Even the thin mattress hurt. Her collarbone throbbed in time with her heartbeat, and when she flexed her fingers, she could still feel the phantom pressure of the assassin's weight dragging against her palms. Tomorrow she would return to the corridors. Tomorrow she would stand ready for the man who held so much in his hands. The thought should have made her feel proud. Instead, it made her feel small. She curled slightly onto her side despite the pain, staring at the low ceiling while the cold knot of dread settled deeper into her stomach. Somewhere beneath the ache and exhaustion, another realization quietly took shape. No one had asked whether she still wanted to be a child. The Order had already chosen for her. A tear slipped silently across her temple into her hair before she closed her eyes. But when morning came, she knew she would still rise and walk back into the shadows.